The brutal winter of 1888 descended upon Oakridge like God's own judgment. Snowflakes, thick as sin, blanketed the small Midwestern town, turning dirt roads into impassable white rivers. Grace Hamilton pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stacked the last bottles of whiskey behind the counter of her family's grocery store. The Hamilton Mercantile stood at the edge of town, the only establishment for miles that sold provisions alongside spirits, a fact that had earned the Hamilton family the scorn of Reverend Thomas and his flock at St. Mary's Catholic Church. In a town where temperance meetings were attended with greater fervor than Sunday Mass, selling alcohol was akin to peddling damnation. "You'll close early today, Miss Hamilton?" Mrs. Peterson asked, eyeing the whiskey bottles with thinly veiled disgust as she paid for her flour and sugar. "Only when the last customer leaves, ma'am," Grace replied, counting out the woman's change. At 23, Grace had learned to wear her pride like armor against the whispers that followed her through town. Mrs. Peterson's lips pinched together. "They're saying this storm is the worst in 30 years. You'd do well to heed the warning. Thank you for your concern." Grace's smile never reached her eyes. After Mrs. Peterson left, Grace stood alone in the emptiness of the store. The walls seemed to close in around her, thick with the weight of 5 years of judgment, since her parents had died of influenza, leaving her to run the family business. 5 years of sidelong glances and hushed conversations that ceased when she entered a room. 5 years of being told by Reverend Thomas that a woman of virtue would close the bar, or better yet, sell the store to a man who could manage it properly. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal. Grace moved to the window, watching snow swirl in violent eddies. In that moment, something inside her broke. She couldn't bear another day of this isolation, of being the town pariah for nothing more than trying to keep her family's legacy alive. Grace made her decision quickly. She would leave, go to Chicago perhaps, where a woman could disappear into the crowd, where no one would know her name or care what she sold. She gathered what little money she had saved, some food, and her warmest clothes. She left a note for her only friend, Beth, and stepped out into the storm. The blizzard's fury hit her like a physical blow. The falling snow was so thick, she could barely see 3 feet ahead. Grace pressed on, determined to reach the train station 5 miles outside town. But within an hour, disorientation set in. The landmarks she knew had vanished under the white blanket, and the biting cold seeped through her clothes. When she stumbled into the woods, Grace knew she had veered far off course. Her legs grew heavy, then numb. A curious warmth spread through her body, despite the cold, and she found herself wanting to rest, just for a moment. She sank to her knees beside a large oak, no longer able to feel her fingers or toes. As consciousness began to slip away, she thought she saw a figure moving toward her through the white veil of snow. Miss Caleb Mason had lived alone in the woods for 3 winters. After returning from the war with a limp and nightmares that left him screaming in the dark, he'd found he could no longer abide the crowds and noise of town life. Out here, with only the trees and wildlife for company, he had found a measure of peace. He'd been checking his traps when he spotted her, a dark heap against the white snow that he initially mistook for a fallen deer. The realization that it was a woman, nearly frozen to death, sent him into immediate action. He lifted her into his arms, noting how light she felt despite her layers of clothing, and carried her back to his cabin. Inside, he worked quickly, stoking the fire to a roar and wrapping her in his warmest blankets. Her face was pale as moonlight, her lips blue with cold. He recognized her then, the Hamilton girl who ran the grocery store in town. He'd seen her once or twice during his infrequent trips for supplies. Hours passed before Grace stirred. When her eyes finally opened, they were the color of summer cornflowers, stark against her pale face. "Am I dead?" she whispered. "No, ma'am," Caleb replied, his voice rough from disuse. "Though you nearly were." Awareness came to her slowly, followed by alarm. She sat up abruptly, clutching the blankets to her chest. "Who are you? Where am I?" "Name's Caleb Mason. This is my cabin. Found you half frozen in the woods." He moved away, giving her space. "Storm's still raging. You'll have to stay until it passes." Grace's mind raced with the implications. A single woman alone with a man she didn't know. It was beyond scandalous. It was ruinous. "I can't stay here," she said, though her body trembled with residual cold. "You'll die if you go back out there," Caleb stated plainly. He offered a steaming cup without waiting for her response. Over the next 3 days, the blizzard showed no signs of abating. Grace learned that Caleb had fought in the war, that he trapped and hunted for his living, trading furs in town twice a year. He spoke little, but when he did, she found herself hanging on each word. There was a gentleness to him that belied his gruff exterior. For his part, Caleb found himself watching Grace when she wasn't looking, the way she absently tucked strands of chestnut hair behind her ear, the determination with which she insisted on helping with chores despite her unfamiliarity with cabin life. On the 4th day, when the storm finally broke, they were surprised by the arrival of a search party. Reverend Thomas was at its head, his expression thunderous when he found Grace in Caleb's cabin. "Miss Hamilton," he said, his voice cold as the snow outside, "the town has been searching for you." Grace lifted her chin. "I'm quite well, as you can see, Reverend. Mr. Mason saved my life." The Reverend's gaze moved between them, taking in the singular bed, the domestic scene of breakfast half eaten on the table. "Your reputation, Miss Hamilton, is already precarious. This," he gestured broadly, "is beyond salvation." "What are you suggesting?" Grace asked, though she knew full well. "I'm suggesting, Miss Hamilton, that either you return with us now to face the consequences of your indiscretion, or you and Mr. Mason present yourselves at St. Mary's on Sunday to be wed." Caleb, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "That decision is between Miss Hamilton and myself, Reverend." "Indeed," the older man replied, his tone making it clear what he thought the only honorable choice would be. After the search party left, with assurances that Grace would return to town the following day, silence filled the cabin. "You don't have to marry me," Grace finally said, staring into the fire. "I can weather their judgment. I've done it before." Caleb studied her, this woman who had burst into his solitary life like a flame in darkness. "And if I said I wanted to?" Grace looked up, surprise evident in her face. "You don't know me." "I know enough," he replied simply. "I know you're brave and stubborn. I know you run a business that supports you, despite what others think. I know you'd rather face a blizzard than live under the weight of their scorn." Something fluttered in Grace's chest. Not love, not yet, but possibility. "It would be a marriage of convenience," she said carefully. "Of necessity." Yes, Caleb agreed, though something in his eyes suggested he might hope for more. The wedding was a somber affair, attended by few. Grace wore her Sunday best, Caleb a clean shirt that strained across his broad shoulders. Reverend Thomas performed the ceremony, with palpable disapproval, and the townspeople who witnessed it did so with avid curiosity rather than joy for the couple. Grace sold the store to Beth's husband, using the money to add a room to Caleb's cabin. They worked side by side, learning the rhythms of each other's days. Caleb taught Grace to identify animal tracks in the snow. She showed him how to make bread that didn't sit like a stone in the stomach. Winter deepened, game grew scarce, and Caleb had to venture further afield to check his traps. One evening, he returned later than usual, his face grim. "Wolf tracks," he said as he hung his coat. A pack, moving closer to the cabin. That night, they listened to the howls, closer than before. Grace found herself reaching for Caleb's hand in the darkness. The wolves came 3 nights later, during a smaller storm, that nonetheless had driven the temperature well below freezing. Caleb and Grace were awakened by the sound of scratching at the door, low growls that raised the hair on the back of their necks. "Get the rifle," Caleb whispered, reaching for the knife he kept beside the bed. Together they faced the pack, Caleb with steady aim, Grace loading cartridges with trembling fingers. When dawn finally broke, 2 wolves lay dead in the snow, and the rest had retreated into the forest. Grace tended to the gash on Caleb's arm, where one wolf had caught him with its claws. Her touch was gentle, her focus absolute. When she finished, she looked up to find him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Thank you," he said softly. "We protected each other," she replied. As winter began its slow retreat, something else bloomed between them. Trust, born of shared danger. Respect, earned through daily interactions. And something deeper, something neither yet dared name. There were still walls between them. Caleb's nightmares that left him gasping in the dark. Grace's moments of fierce independence, when memories of town judgment resurfaced. But there were also moments of surprising tenderness. Caleb's hand at the small of her back as they walked through the woods. Grace's fingers lingering on his as she passed him a cup of coffee. On the first truly warm day of spring, they sat together on the porch Caleb had built, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Do you regret it?" Caleb asked suddenly. "Marrying me?" Grace considered the question, thinking of the life she might have had in Chicago, anonymous but alone. She thought of the town that had scorned her, of the blizzard that had nearly taken her life, and she thought of the man beside her, who had saved her in more ways than one. "No," she said finally, "I don't regret it." Caleb's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. "Nor do I." Between them hung the unspoken question. Could this marriage, born of duty and circumstance, become something chosen, something cherished? As the last light of day faded, and the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, neither had the answer. But as they sat hand in hand, watching darkness settle over the woods that had become their home, both felt the stirring of possibility, and perhaps, in time, of love.